Hello, leaders. Welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, Philipp Carlsson. He's the managing director and partner and global chief economist at Boston Consulting Group and co-author of a brand new book called Shocks, Crises, and False Alarms. Philipp, thank you for joining me.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
So as we were talking about before I hit record, not your typical audience. You're doing a lot of podcasts on the economy, very deep dives into all sorts of different topics. So we're going to be talking about the context of your book, more applicable for a leadership audience. So it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these things apply to the business audience and also why leaders should even care about this stuff. So let's start high level with why you even wrote this book to begin with.
Yeah, the economy worked like a charm for executives, for investors for several decades. It was really not an issue in boardrooms. We call that the good macro regime. After, say, 1990, there was a confluence of powerful tailwinds that made life pretty easy from an economic perspective. The real economy,
What were the tailwinds, by the way?
Yeah, these three tailwinds are the real economy. Cycles were growing longer. Recessions became more rare. The global economy was converging in that way with trade. In the financial realm, inflation came down structurally. Interest rates, therefore, also came down structurally. And then institutionally and globally, we also had this process of convergence where global rules just became much more easier to do business globally and earn profits overseas, sell into the world. And so, the global economy was really not front and center for leaders most of that time. Well, there was a global financial crisis of 2008, a big discontinuity there. But overall, they didn't care too much about macro. And now, with sort of the succession of shocks that we had, COVID, and then you got the inflation spike, and then interest rates soared to bring inflation under control, and then sort of cyclical worries around recession that was predicted and never arrived. There's just so much seesawing narrative of macro decline and shocks that leaders need to take this seriously. They need to think a lot harder about how to read the economy. It's not going to be enough to read the headlines or to trust models to give them answers.
So it kind of sounds like we were spoiled for the past few decades, which is really interesting because I think if you take the 2008 financial crisis, to your point, that almost 20 years, we've had it pretty good. Do you think a lot of leaders are just not prepared? Because, you work with a lot of executives, I'm sure, as does your firm. And there's always these different types of playbooks that leaders have, that CEOs have. And so if we never had a very difficult economic time for several decades, we probably don't have very relevant or up-to-date playbooks. So when the pandemic happened, wars are breaking out, all this talk of recession and inflation. Is it safe to say that a lot of business leaders specifically out there were just not prepared? They just don't know how to deal with these types of things because they haven't had to do it before?
For sure. And, it's almost a generational thing. You'd have to be a certain age to have experienced these things firsthand. This confluence of tailwinds that I just described. You'd have to be 55, older, to have experienced sort of the bad macro world of high and volatile inflation before. And so basically the current generation of leaders, they've grown up against this more benign backdrop. And so it's infinitely harder now to realize what's happening and how to deal with it. There's little doubt about that.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the state of the economy. I know this is a huge area of focus for you, but I just want to touch on it a little bit just to give people perspective on how you think things are now in 2024 and could potentially be in 2025, because obviously that's going to impact a lot of businesses, at least a lot of executives that I have been speaking with in the business space, in the HR space. Even my wife, she does work in the consumer or customer experience space. We're seeing a lot of people are scared to spend money, right? That, we have the upcoming election and everyone's kind of in pause mode and everyone's just kind of waiting to see what happens. And meanwhile, you see a lot of news out there, of course, whether you look at home prices or I think Americans are $1 trillion spending on credit card debt. You see the deficit, which is 30 something trillion dollars. You see a massive debt. I mean, if you go to the news, with the exception of the stock market that appears to be at all-time highs, whether you look at gas prices, grocery prices, it seems that there's a lot of doom and gloom in the economy that's out there. Would you say that is that an accurate representation of where we are, or is there kind of a more positive outlook that you see happening?
Well, a big theme in the book is really the doomsaying that is so pervasive. I'm not saying there are no challenges in the economy, and there's hardship in certain parts of the consumer landscape, and all of that is real. There's a distribution of experiences, but the aggregate is a success story, right? I mean, let's just recap briefly. We were told in sort of conventional wisdom in the headlines, everyone was screaming that the recession was inevitable in 2023 and
Yep.
certainly for the current year.
And some people
It's
say
not
it
just,
still might happen.
well, there will be another recession for sure. I mean, there will always be another recession,
Yeah.
but that's not a great way of predicting a downturn, right? I
You mean
mean,
you
it's
shouldn't
sort of
live in
like,
fear?
yeah, well, actually, you should be a rational optimist, is what the book argues. But public discourse is heavily skewed to the downside. The
Yeah.
economy is always portrayed as teetering on the edge, the cliff edge, and one wrong step, and we're falling to our economic death. And the truth is, it is just not constructed like that. And we have had a string of false alarms the last few years, where the reality played out a lot better than all this doomsaying. I mean, to your point. In aggregate, consumers are still very healthy. You see consumption is still very strong. It's softened a little bit, but from very, very high levels. Americans today, they're spending a lot more in inflation-adjusted terms. So in real terms, they're spending way more on consumption than they did pre-pandemic. The labor market's booming still. There's no real softening that should be worrying in the labor market at this point. Real wages are growing. What do we
Can I
mean
ask
by
you
that?
one question about the labor market really quick? So,
Sure.
and correct me if I'm wrong. So there was a recent employment numbers that came out, and I know at least I can't remember. I believe it was in California. I can't remember if it was nationally or in California, but they kept revising numbers. Right, the numbers came out. They made it look very positive, and then they revised them, and the numbers were far lower than what they thought. And again, I can't remember if that was California or national. But the broader question is around, are the jobs that we're seeing created part-time or full-time jobs? Because one of the stats that I remember seeing is that a lot of the new growth in jobs is not actually in full-time work, it's in part-time work, and full-time work is potentially going down. So A, is that true? And is that a concern if we see labor growth more in part-time versus full-time work?
Yeah, so the first part of your point, Jacob, there are always revisions to macro data. That's one of the things why this is so hard to navigate.
Yeah.
This isn't like natural sciences and atoms do this and they always do behave like this. Macro variables, they're all over the place and they're constant revisions. So you can look at sort of the moving averages over the last 6 months of revisions and all that to get a handle on that. On the job market, there is no real story to tell of genuine softening at this point, and we're now in July of 2024. There is always a differentiation between different segments of the labor market, full-time, part-time, et cetera, and you
Yeah.
can go very much into the weeds, but you got to ask yourself, if the labor market was truly weakening, we wouldn't see payrolls, so that the hiring, the actual headcount go up. We wouldn't see wage growth that is strong. Wage growth would be low. We would see the quits rate go up, but the quits rate isn't like exploding or anything like that. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is across the many variables of the labor market, it's a very, very tough story to tell that the labor market is imperiled or very weak.
What about things like the home prices, inflation? That's obviously a huge concern for a lot of people. I can't remember what the recent stat is, but there was something that came out that said if most Americans had a $500 medical emergency, I think it was like less than a half of them would be able to come up with the money for that expense. And people can fact check what that number was, but it's not many Americans are able to save. And people might be listening and watching this thinking like, what the hell does that have to do with me if I have a full-time job? But obviously all of this impacts how business gets done, the decisions that leaders make, whether people should stay in their current jobs or if there's opportunity to look for new jobs. So I kind of just want to set the stage for people so that they get a sense of the world that they're leading and operating and doing business in, because I think that's very important. And, to your point, a lot of leaders are not prepared for this kind of stuff. And we don't spend enough time thinking about this from a leadership perspective unless you're in the field of economics.
No, for sure. I mean, there are a number of points there. Let me unpack bit by bit. So first of all, inflation's really on the right track. I mean, just yesterday you had a CPI print. It was very, very good. It was
Yep.
actually negative. If you unpack that, a lot of the things that were worrisome, like shelter inflation or rent inflation, has now really taken a step down. Really encouraging. But keep in mind, inflation is a change concept. It's something that it's a growth rate, right? It's not a level concept. And so even as the rate of change slows, as it does now, that doesn't mean that your sticker price is lower. So if you used to pay $10 for a burger and a drink, and now you pay 16, because inflation's down doesn't mean that you're going back to 10, right? Inflation is a change concept. It just means that the rate increase has slowed. It doesn't mean that the sticker price comes down.
Not going to go back from
For the
16 to 10.
Exactly. And for the sticker price to come down, you'd have to have deflation, so negative price growth, like, consistently.
Yeah.
And that, you don't want that in the economy either. That has that has other problems that you don't want. So look, generally, inflation is very true from a levels perspective, and consumers care about how many dollars is there on my receipt when I walk out of the supermarket, right? It is higher than it was. The rate of change has slowed, so it's grinding higher at a much slower pace. What we also need to factor into this conversation is wage growth. And wage growth has been strong, and wage growth has been stronger than inflation. So that means that the purchasing power, what people earn and what they can buy with that, is growing at a positive rate now. And that is a big tailwind cyclically to the economy. It was already last year, and that continues in 2024. So that's the piece of inflation. Look,
I have
macro.
one question for you on that really quick. So is the fact that wages have been going up always a good thing, or is that potentially a sign of desperation that companies are trying to keep the people that they have? Because I know, for example, that one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that so many organizations were scared to lose their people, and so many companies had a hard time finding talent that the salaries just went all over the place. And I've heard so many stories of employees who were making more than their boss's boss, and they wanted equity in the company. And it was kind of like a grab as much as you can from the company. And in a sense, a lot of organizations felt that they didn't really have a choice, right? I mean, if you wanted to have employees there, and if you wanted to be able to hire this new engineer, you had to pay them this ridiculous salary. So in that sense, is it a good thing that the wage growth has been going up, and has it been going up at a realistic pace? Is it like what's your perspective on what happened with that?
So it's a very clear two-sided answer that I have for you. It's great for workers. It's not so great for firms. Wage growth eats into the profits of firms unless they can also grow their productivity at the same rate. But the winners of a tight labor market are workers, particularly at the bottom. The best way to help the weakest parts of the labor market is a tight labor market where firms are having to pay up to get their hands on those workers they need. And this has been true the last 2-3 years. The fastest wage growth did not come at the top, white collar and highly paid jobs. The fastest wage growth came further down the distribution. And that is a good thing. And that is something that America really, really needed, and hopefully will continue to be that way. A tight labor market is the best way of achieving that. In our book, we argue that we're in an era of tightness. So it's not just sort of a blip. It's not just a few quarters of tightness. We say that we've already been in tightness for many years. By the way, this tight labor market, it predates COVID. So the labor market turned tight already in 2017. COVID was a brief interruption. Unemployment went very high. It came down as fast as it went up. And now we continue in this era of tightness. And we think going forward, even if you get another recession, and you will eventually, but seeing through the next recession, you will still stay in a tighter labor market, and that is beneficial to wage earners, particularly those at the bottom.
Do you want to hear something really crazy? 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed. Help me change that number around by subscribing so that you can get access to more videos just like this one. Yeah, and so I'm in California, and I think we've kind of seen that happen, right? Where we raised the minimum wage for a lot of fast food workers, I think, to $20. And then what happened is you saw a lot of businesses who either had to file for bankruptcy or close their stores in California, or they had to let go of drivers if they were delivery drivers for brands like Pizza Hut. So to your point, like the wages went up, which is technically good for workers, but then as a result, a lot of these businesses were saying we can't afford to pay these workers anymore. So it's this really interesting balance that people are trying to figure out. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Great for workers if you can find a job that's going to pay you that amount, but bad for businesses if you're thinking I can't pay people to work in my restaurant anymore.
It is about balance. Minimum wages have been studied for a long, long time. For a long time, the consensus was minimum wages are bad because it's going to create unemployment.
Yeah.
The reality is a little more calibrated. We've seen many economies with minimum wages that are consistent with high levels of employment, and where you also just generate living wages that are needed. And so it's about how high is it? It's about balance, as you rightly say. I haven't looked at California. I know what's happening broadly. I haven't studied exactly.
Oh,
We
California is a
often
little bit
have
of a
to
mess.
we often have to be careful what's anecdotal evidence and what's out there.
Yeah.
My hunch is the unemployment rate in California is pretty low as it is natural as it is nationally. So there's always the risk of anecdotal evidence and extrapolating that to the aggregate. Unemployment rate in the U.S. is really, really low.
Yeah. I mean, actually, from what I remember, California has the highest unemployment rate in the nation.
Okay, fair enough.
So we're
Yeah.
not, I mean, we got our problems here in California. I love the state, but we have our issues here. So why should people care about any of this stuff? Because again, a lot of people who are listening and watching to this, they don't work in Moody's. Maybe some are in finance. They're not in any kind of economic fields. They're leaders of teams. They're
Yeah.
employees who are just trying to be successful at their company, or maybe they're senior executives. Why do they need to
Yeah.
care about any of this stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about 2020 when the pandemic hit. And so that would take us to March, April of that year. And what was the narrative that you were exposed to as a leader, as a citizen, as anyone really? You were told that this is the biggest collapse ever
Yep.
and that the recovery will be worse than 2008, which
Yep.
was a traumatic experience for not just Americans globally. And people talked about a Great Depression like the 1930s. Thought leaders came out and said, look, the recovery is at least 6 years until you recover the unemployment rate to a low enough level that's acceptable. So, what were you going to do in that moment? Well, we
Hide
know
under the
what,
bed.
yeah, or worse, or worse. We know that some executives they took this at face value, and if you look across, for example, the auto industry, well, they thought they were not going to sell any cars the next many years, so they cut their semiconductor orders. And then when instead they got this roaring recovery, they were at the back of the line and they couldn't get their hands on the chips that they need
Yeah.
for their cars. And then what happened? Not only did they lose out on the sales, they also contributed to this whole inflation spike because remember where a lot of the really fast inflation was? It was in car prices, used car prices.
Yeah.
We're past this now, but that was the eye of the storm for quite a while, 22 and into 23. And so what I'm trying to say is there are real traps there in the macro space and the macro narratives you're exposed to. They're usually to the downside. If you act on them, well, it can be very costly. And not just financially, it can also be a leadership cost. I mean, if you run a firm, big or small, and you act on the whim and you act on the up and down on these narratives and news cycles, you're sending your organization in this direction, then you're sending in that direction. There's an upside there for those who can see through the noise, be a little calmer in the face of all these gyrations, and to have a more structural narrative of how the economy operates.
And what if you're not on a leadership role? You're just an individual contributor. I'm
Same.
just somebody who has a job. I show up. I pay my taxes. Why should I be caring about this?
Well, I mean, same story. I mean, look, when the labor market was so extremely tight, I mean, it's cooled, and that's what we wanted because it fueled inflation. But you saw, for example, the quits rate, like voluntary quitting of jobs. It was very, very high. Well,
Yeah.
people looked around them and they said, wow, this is a booming economy. There's so many job openings. People are throwing this and that offer at me. Well, I'm going to hop jobs because on average, you change your job, you may be squeezing 5, 7, 8, even 10%, maybe
Hmm.
sometimes higher in wage gains. And so if you feel comfortable about the economy, you read it well, you might be more comfortable saying, okay, I'm going to hop, I'm going to go to something that pays me more. And if you feel like, okay, I'm convinced that the economy is actually softening, maybe you want to hold on. And that's currently what we're seeing. The quits rate is down a lot. but not at sort of a level where you say this is a bad situation.
I have one, and this is going to be a U.S. specific question. So sorry, everybody who's listening and watching who's international. There have been a couple articles that are coming out saying, the American dream is over. Like it's not possible. You have people like Scott Galloway who say that Gen Z is just, I'm not going to curse on this show, but they're just effed every possible way. Their home prices are too high. They're not getting paid enough. They're lonely. And he brings in kind of the finance and the psychological aspect. I was recently at an event for Edward Jones, and they were talking about this massive transfer of wealth that's going to be happening over the coming years. Something like, 40 or 50 trillion. So what is going on in that regard with the American dream? Is it still achievable? Because a lot of people, especially if they're not in that senior leadership role, they're trying to figure out, can I still be successful? Can I still afford to buy a home? Is the future going to be optimistic for me? What's your general consensus on the idea of the American dream?
There are a number of ways of looking at this, and the most sober way would be to look at studies of social mobility, both time series wise, the history within the U.S. and cross-sectionally comparing it with other economies. And certainly, particularly cross-sectionally, if you look at it, it transpires that the proverbial American dream, rags to riches, that story has a big pop culture element, and that's a little overplayed. There are other rich economies where social mobility is actually stronger, where sort of the possibility to rise is certainly as strong as in the U.S., if not higher. Education, the access to education plays a big role. So some rich economies have organized themselves to just make the whole range of education from nursery all the way to postgraduate education, basically free of charge, and they're reaping the benefits of that over the long run. So I think there is certainly a reason to look very closely and say, well, how much of that narrative and that proverbial story is true. That said, look, I'm always going back to the data, and I encourage everyone to actually study the data, not the headlines, not the narratives, not the opinion pieces. Homeownership is actually higher for the younger generations than is commonly believed. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's not quite as dire as you think. The ability to make progress in the economy is still substantial. Labor market's tight. The ability to get ahead is there. The profile changes. New skills are demanded, but that was always true. Technology has always sort of made inroads into existing job distributions, and that's shifting, and that will happen now. So a lot of it comes down to where are students and workers placing their bets? How do they want to get educated? What do they want to specialize in? But to me, it doesn't ring quite true that there isn't a future for them. There will still be sizable parts of the population, and as in the past, they will make progress, they will build wealth, they will make better pay over the long run. And is it less favorable than certain windows in history? Yeah, I believe that, but it can also change. And this era of tightness I described, this perpetual tightness in the labor market, is really helping those who are working in the labor market, selling their labor into the labor market, and need to get rewarded for that.
I did want to ask you about the impact of AI in a couple minutes. But before we get into that, we were talking about, and you were talking about things like looking at data, for example. Well, what is the best way for leaders or for individuals to make sense of what's happening? Because obviously, one of the sections of your book is about false alarms, right? Shocks, crises, and false alarms. How do we spot that stuff? Because to your point, a lot of people, what they do, they open up Apple News or Google News, they scroll through the headlines, and pretty much everything that you see and read is the world is coming to an end, you're going to lose all your money, and it's just, why bother waking up in the morning? Are there any ways that people, just the average person, and maybe leaders separately, can do a better job of spotting false alarms? Like, how can you navigate, because there's so much data out there, there's so many podcasts, there's so many books, and obviously you can't predict what the future is going to be, but how do you recommend that we make more informed and accurate decisions and not kind of fall into this this false alarm scenario?
Yeah, not everyone has access to analytical tools and data and the skills, and that's absolutely right. The book really argues for those who can build the skill, they should, and they should invest in this. But and they can. The question you're asking is beyond that and says, how can anyone who's consuming any news and narrative, how can they deal with that? A good starting point is ask who's speaking and from what perch and why they're saying it and what have they said in the past. Look, big crises can and do happen. I'm not saying there's no risk out there. There can be other big, ugly crises. But for every one such realized big crisis, there are many false alarms. And when you look at some of the doomsaying out there and you dig a little and say, well, what have they said in the past? Well, what are the last 10, 12 predictions? You often find that there's sort of serial, compulsive, doomsaying. A broken clock is right twice a day. So if I go around and say, well, everything is going to fall apart, we're going to get the recession, if not this year, the next year, if not next year, then the next year after, eventually we'll get a recession and you'll say, look, I told you, we got the recession, right? And there's the same way you can say, well, we can get the recession and we can get the dollar meltdown and we can get a hyperinflation and we can get all the wars in the world you want to talk about. The point is we need to think about risk as a distribution, right? And there are risks that are ugly at the tails of that distribution and we shouldn't ignore them. But it's wrong to drag them from the tails of the distribution to the very center of it and make it your base case. You're free to do that, but you're just constantly being worried about collapse. And at some point you need to realize and say, well, just look at the 4 years. That went a lot better than all the doomsaying that was predicted. Right?
Yeah, it's almost like that saying, time heals all wounds, where, when you look things from at a broader perspective over several years, a decade, 2 decades, you see that things usually, actually almost always, balance out and improve. Whether you look at the 2008 financial crisis or the pandemic, if you give yourself that broader time horizon, things go up. I think the challenge that so many people have is we're so stuck in these short time horizons, right? We're stuck in, because that's how we think. I mean, whether it's with social media and we want instant gratification, and we want things right away. We want to know what's happening now. And so it's hard, right? I mean, you see a bad headline and you think, end of the year, I'm going to lose all my money.
So I like the idea of the timeline. You're very right. Often it requires a leap of faith to see the longer run, the big sweep of decades rather than quarters or months. The other thing one needs to keep in mind is aggregates are always deceptive. When I say the economy is strong right now in July 2024, that is not inconsistent with the reality that certain firms are hurting. Okay, and that's not inconsistent with the fact that some consumers are hurting. These two are not contradicting each other, because the economy, the macro thing, is the collection of all these experiences, and we're netting all that up, right? And the thing is, on sum, in total, it is a strong economy, but it is absolutely correct that there are certain sectors, certain parts of the consumer population that are having a much harder time than others. There's no doubt about it.
Thanks for tuning in. And if you are interested in taking this conversation even further, then make sure to subscribe to Future Ready Leadership Plus, where for a few dollars every single month, you will get access to a bonus episode with every single one of my amazing guests, as well as ad-free listening. And make sure to also join our Future Ready Leadership newsletter, which you can get access to for free by going to thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. Again, that's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, of course, I and my team, we would love it if you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And please send this episode to somebody who you would like to see become a future-ready leader. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Now let's get back to the show. I wanted to talk a little bit about AI because that comes up a lot for leaders, just the impact of technology, the impact of AI. And this has been a conversation that's been around for a long time, but I feel like especially after ChatGPT came about, the conversation just took off. And they're at ChatGPT 4.0 now, and people are wondering what's going to happen when we get ChatGPT 5 and 6 and 7, right? I mean, 2-3 years away, we'll probably be at ChatGPT who knows what. And there was also many years ago when we had ATMs, a lot of people assumed that if we have ATMs, that's going to be the end of bank tellers. That's going to be the end of, the branches of banks. And then instead what we saw is actually more bank tellers and more branches came about. And so we assume that technology is always going to replace things. And, we're not always correct with that. So what is your general perspective on the impact that AI and technology is going to have? Are we going to replace billions of people over the next 10 years, or what's going to be the outcome that you foresee?
Yeah, the book has a whole chapter on just that topic, and I think it's an important one. Essentially, what economists call technological unemployment. So exactly your idea that tech, kills all the jobs and creates mass joblessness. That is a prediction that is super, super old and has always failed.
Yeah.
There's no history of whatsoever, but the fear has always been there. I mean, just a few examples. Bill Gates in the 2010s, he propagated a robot tax. He thought that automation
Oh,
in
I remember that.
production.
Yeah.
You remember that, right?
Yeah.
Nobody talks about the robot tax today. Why? Because the unemployment rate is near record lows. But that prediction is much, much older. It goes back, decades and centuries almost. And Nobel Prize winners have said that human labor would go the way of the horse. And when the automobile hit, that hasn't happened. Look, there is a reason for that. And I want to illustrate it to you with the example we use in the book. In 1870, 50% of Americans, half of Americans worked on a farm in agriculture.
Wow.
And they spent around 45% of their income on food. Okay. Then you had successive waves of technology that really displaced all this labor. Today, it's just barely, or I think it's around 1% of Americans work in agriculture, right? But do you know how much we spend on food? What share of our income do we spend on food? It's just 12%. So what has happened is that technology has removed all this labor, lowered the cost, therefore lowered prices, and we've had a huge real income boost where once we spend almost half on food, now just 12%. What happened with the gap? Well, that's a real income gain, and now we spend it on anything from Netflix to vacations and clothes and stuff that we didn't even know about when some of these technological innovations hit us. So what I'm trying to say is technology is really deflationary. It takes out costs, it lowers prices because firms are going to lower their prices to gain market share over the long run. And so it is a real income boost, and that drives new demand, and that new demand, it also drives new employment. So that's
Tesla's
why
a good
this.
example of that, actually, with what they've been doing with their electric cars and using tech. Like their new Model 3 just came out, and Elon Musk put out a tweet, and he was saying something like, 339 miles per charge, $35,000 for the car, which is, I think, one of the cheapest electric cars on the market. Nobody thought that was going to be possible, and now he's taking over the world.
Okay, I'm not particularly familiar with that example or the car, but I think we see it in many parts of the economy over the long run where tech has that effect. So the question we need to ask ourselves, do we think that AI is different? Could AI be different from other technological innovations in the past where we don't have that final step to new job creation because incomes are rising? And for that, you'd have to believe that all future jobs will go to either a robot or an algorithm or the combination of the two. Honestly, I think yes, the technology will make inroads in the labor market. There will be displacement. There will be what I described, where new jobs arise. Nobody thought of social media marketing manager as a job 20 years ago, and yet it's here, and I hear it pays six figures, and things like that will happen again over the next 15, 20 years. Yep. But I think at the same time, it's reasonable to assume that technology will be more capable than in the past to consistently displace some of this labor. And so over the very long run, I think you'll see a big shift in the job profiles that we have and that we'll have in the future.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think about the types of things that ChatGPT can do now, whether it's designing logos, or whether it's creating templates for a landing page, or whether it's writing copy, or helping you find research or reports or stuff. So I think a lot of people are worried because in the past, when we've talked about AI and robots, we always assumed it would be something like in a factory in manufacturing. We always thought of those robots that Amazon has, where they kind of they move the shelves to you instead of having the workers go to the shelves. But now we're seeing a lot of it happen in these white collar spaces, leadership, management, decision making, content creation. So people are, you know, a little freaked out in that regard. So I guess from your perspective, you think there's going to be some disruption, but it also sounds like you're a little bit optimistic that new opportunities will be created in areas that we haven't thought of before, to your point, like the social media manager.
Yeah, I mean, to the point. I mean, I don't think we'll have mass unemployment in 2040. I don't
Okay.
think so. I don't think it moves that fast. To me, that's too doomsaying. It will be a balance, and job profiles will probably shift towards skills where humans retain competitive advantage. The machine, the algorithm really has to do it better than the human. And there's some use cases where that becomes increasingly credible, that capability will grow. But in the end, there's a lot of things that you'll want a human to do with or for you. And more of the job distribution will shift into that. And so I think it's too soon to sort of expect the mass unemployment and Armageddon. I mean, really, what we also need to keep in mind is if you have a world where machines can do all this for you, that is not necessarily a negative at all. Why? Because it's hugely technologically will be hugely deflationary. Real incomes would hugely rise, and the affordability of stuff would rise as well. So it's for those who really want to tell that story, it's not actually a doomsday story in that sense.
Are you worried that we might rely too much on technology for things like decision making and not understand how the technology comes up with the ideas or the decisions or the prescriptions for certain things, and that we're just gonna do what the technology says without the human checking behind it?
Yeah, it's a big theme in the book in the sense that, we call that master model mentality, the idea that you can entrust analysis to a big economic model and it will tell you what happens in the economy next. And as we discussed earlier, that just failed, was like a serial failure the last few years. Why do we walk into that trap often? Well, because we have too much trust in the scientific foundation of such economic models. We think it works like physics or like chemistry, and that's just not true. And so we're placing too much trust in being able to outsource that and say, well, give me the answer. In the end, it comes down to judgment calls, right? It comes down to judgment calls. It comes down to leaders, individuals saying, this is what I believe on the basis of what I've taken in and information and the analysis I've undertaken. And that is a thing that machines will have a much harder time to make inroads into. And that's why the timeline of this is often overstated.
Yeah, I'm always interested in those models and how that works. I recently heard about, I don't know if you're familiar with this fund called the Medallion Fund by Renaissance Technologies, created by James Simmons. You familiar with that?
Jim, yeah.
Or
Mhm.
Jim? Yeah, and I recently learned about that, and I don't think most people are familiar with that story, but it seems like he used a lot of I mean, I don't, mathematical models and computation and quants, and he had the highest performing fund ever. Where and the fees that they were taking out were ridiculous. What is it, like 20 or 30% management fees? And even after they were taking out those management fees, the company was still delivering returns of like 30+% every year, and it's known as the most successful fund in the world. And he passed away fairly recently. But it's just a crazy story of how some people out there are able to build, I don't know, these models, these calculations, these tools to be able to predict this stuff. I mean, it's just crazy. And I'm sure that's obviously a lot of, in the economic space, a lot of what happens. And it's really just a
Yeah.
fascinating
So
place.
yeah, I mean, this is an example from the tail of the distribution, the right side of the tail. Medallion Fund, very successful at doing this, using technology and models to invest and bet on markets. It's impressive. But even for them, predicting the cycle, will that be easy with a model? No. Do they have ways of winning even when the cycle is turning down? Yes. So, it's in the end, what is it that you're predicting? Is it the underlying economy, or is it how markets might react and how you can find, inefficiencies in markets that you use for your advantage? The predictability of a lot of these things remains very, very constrained. And that brilliant actors manage to be very profitable in this uncertain world is not at all surprising or untoward. It's a reality.
Let's shift gears a little bit now that we have 15 or so minutes left to a section I like to call it Leaders Toolkit, where we explore something maybe practical or actionable for a lot of leaders out there. And for this case, I wanted to go over what you have in the book, these 3 habits for leaders to navigate economic uncertainty. And it's probably also just, correct me if I'm wrong, I think these are just good habits for uncertainty in general. Like when I was going through them, I think there's just a lot of really interesting things that can be applied to uncertainty generally. And they were reject the master model, discount doom mongering, and economic eclecticism, which I love that as well. In the beginning of the book, you have like this chart that kind of walks through that. So let's start off with the first one, rejecting the master model. So what does that mean for leaders, and how do you develop that habit? Alrighty, everybody, my conversation with Patrick Carlsson continues, but you have to be a premium subscriber of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts to get access to that conversation. And in that bonus episode, we're going to be talking about 3 habits that leaders can put into practice in order to navigate not just economic uncertainty, but uncertainty in general. And the 3 habits that we're going to be talking about are rejecting the master model, discounting doom mongering, and economic eclecticism. And again, these are not just for economic uncertainty. I think these are very helpful and tactical tips to just approach uncertainty in general. So if you want to get access to that conversation, it's around 15 or so minutes, as are all the bonus episodes, then make sure to subscribe to Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts, and you will get a bonus episode every week, as well as ad-free listening. I hate ads. I'm sure you hate ads, but they help keep the lights on for the podcast. So if you want to remove all those ads, it's only a couple dollars a month, and you'll get access to a lot of really cool stuff. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to share it with somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Of course, I love any reviews and feedback that I get from you. And last but not least, you can head over to Substack, greatleadership.substack.com. That's where you can find the show notes, the transcript, and it's also where I share a lot of my insights on leadership and the future of work and all sorts of cool stuff. So head on over there, and thanks again for tuning in and for watching. I'll see you very soon.